All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the latest installment of IS4, the Indonesia Social Science Seminar Series. This virtual series brings together experts of Indonesia from all around the world to discuss pressing issues facing the country. IS4 is sponsored by the Sydney Southeast Asia Center, the Cornell Southeast Asia Program, and the Royal Netherlands Institute of Southeast Asian and Caribbean Studies. I'm Sam Bazzi, an economist at UC San Diego, and I'll be chairing this talk today. I'm absolutely delighted to welcome our speaker, Naila Shofia, who recently graduated from Bocconi in Milan, Italy. She's now based at Yale and US and as an assistant professor in the Division of Social Science. Naila's research examines how cultural and social identity shapes economics and politics, with a particular focus on Indonesia. She won a prestigious dissertation prize from the UniCredit Foundation. Professor Shofia will present for around 20 to 25 minutes. Then we'll hear from our discussant, Vicky Fouka, who's currently an assistant professor at Stanford University. Her main research focus is on group identity and in-group, out-group relations. She explores the conditions under which minority members identify with and are accepted by a majority, and the implications of that for the design of policies and institutions. Vicky will speak for about 10 minutes. That'll leave around 20 minutes for Q&A, and please do put those questions in the Q&A box, and I'll moderate after the discussion. All right, so with that, I'm gonna hand it over to Naila to begin her talk.
Okay, let me share my screen now. Okay, so can anyone see the screen? Okay, yeah, so thanks for having me, everyone. Good evening for those of you who are in the United States. Selamat pagi buat Anda yang ada di Indonesia, and good morning for those of you who are in Australia. So today I will be talking about one of my research projects that analyze or study about the phenomenon of religious veiling and its role in helping or hindering female access to a labor force in particular. So I'm just gonna start with the motivation of the study. So the study was started from a general observation in development economics, where economic development tend to create more incentive for women to take up more of public role. What do I mean by this? So as the economy develop and becoming more sophisticated, there will be more jobs that are available that are more mentally intensive rather than physically intensive. And these type of jobs are very suitable for women. At the same time, economic development typically is also experience the shift or the movement from production processes from household to either factories or offices. So the implication of this is that people in general, or women in general, who want to take up these new economic opportunities has to leave their homes in order to get the benefit of this new lucrative job, and therefore they have to perform more of their public role. But at the same time, many societies, including in Indonesia, are governed by social norms that typically draw a clear demarcation between men and women and what are their ideal roles in the society. In particular, men are typically assigned the task as a breadwinner, and therefore their perceived perfect role has to be in public, while women are typically assigned as a domestic manager or taking care of the household, and therefore their ideal place is to be inside the home or taking care of domestic responsibilities. So in this type of environment, when these two phenomenon happened together at the same time, what happened was that women who try to reap the benefit of this economic development has to bear a personal and social cost because of the social norms. So an example of personal cost is that for women who grew up in a society that assigned the responsibility of taking care of children to women, they might perceive or feel guilty if they go out and get the job outside of the home, because they have been brought up by the thought that, oh, working women might actually have a negative consequences on intellectual or emotional development of their children, okay? So the social cost that can come up from this is, for instance, recently there is a new paper by Leo Burstein and company showing that women who display some kind of trait in the labor market, such as, you know, if you take like this highly paid, well-paid, cashy jobs, it perceived that this type of women are ambitious or autonomous or you know, being very independent. And this kind of traits that is related to the act of taking employment outside of the home normally is perceived negatively in the marriage market, okay? So this personal and social cost is something that could become a barrier for women to enter the labor force. Now, some women in this context might try to lower this personal and social cost by using some type of culturally inspired tools. So in this paper, I'm focusing on religious veil as one of these culturally inspired tools that help women to access the formal labor market, but at the same time, it also helps them to navigate strict social norms in the society. In particular, in the context of, you know, highly religious Muslim majority countries, veiling might be super efficient and powerful as a integration device that I'm going to discuss a bit more later. So how does veiling could help women to get these two things at the same time? So there are at least two mechanisms that work here. And this is basically the mechanism that I borrowed from a paper by Carvalho that is published in 2013 in QJE. So the first mechanism is to use veiling as the anchor for beliefs. So what do I mean by that? So for women who are a true believer in their religious values, when these women enter the formal labor market and they have to mingle with other men that are not part of their family members, veil can help them to remind them of all of the value, religious value that they believed in, okay? So veil in this case could act as a commitment device, okay? So sometimes when I want to have a commitment device, I have a lot of post-it on my wall saying that, oh, you have to send this paper by this deadline and so on and so forth. And these commitment devices are usually like very tacky, you know, something that, you know, very feasible. So veil in this case can work in the same way. So it reminds the woman that, look, even if I am working in the environment with a lot of temptations, veil is going to help them to remind themselves to be true to the value that they believe in, so that they are not tempted to engage in or even having a thought to engage in activities that are not in line with their religious values or religious beliefs. So that is the first mechanism. The second mechanism is to use the veil as a signaling device. So I have mentioned before, in terms of social cost, working women might be perceived as, you know, autonomous, independent, and, you know, wearing the veil in the context of places like Indonesia, for instance, might signal different traits that might counter those traits that are perceived to be not desirable in the marriage market. So wearing the veil might be perceived by this, might send the signals to the society of the type of the girl as someone who is more feminine or faithful or rule-abiding, and these traits could counteract those other traits that are perceived negatively in the marriage market, for instance. So these are two mechanisms in which a veil could help women to achieve both access to the formal labor market, but at the same time, it helps to protect their dignity and values in a society. All right, so those are the basic framework that I'm using to conduct this study. First, I'm gonna show you here just a simple plot as a motivation of, whether, this idea is completely off or have some kind of, empirical bearings. So here I'm showing you a simple plot of the co-evolution of veiling and formal job participation. So the solid line here is showing you the fraction of young women who wear the veil across the years. And the dashed line here is showing you the participation of young female population in formal and in informal work. So what we can see here, the evolution of veiling seems to go hand in hand with female access or participation in formal work. And this doesn't seem to be the case when we look at the evolution of informal work. So this graph kind of gives us some kind of motivation of there might be something interesting to dwell further in this case. So what I do in this paper is basically showing you that the increase in the availability of formal employment for women is one of the important driver of veiling. And my argument is that this is not just any jobs, but only jobs that compel women to leave their domestic roles. What I do next is showing you the data, the empirical strategy, the regression results, and I will discuss some of the mechanism that could explain the phenomenon that we are witnessing. So as a preview, what I find is that 1 percentage point increase in female labor participation in formal employment has increased about 2 percentage point increase in veiling. And during the discussion on the mechanism, I would argue that veil, in this case, the mechanism that seems to be most supported by the evidence is to see this veiling as a device, as a negotiation device that help women to access the formal labor market, but also help them to protect their dignity in the society. So I'm going to go very quickly into the literature. I'm very lucky to have Fouka here to discuss my paper because I cited her paper a lot in my work. And she's one of the few scholars who wrote specifically about the practice of veiling. My contribution in this strand of literature is basically to the first empirical test that link specifically the veiling to the incentive in the labor market using the original data. Another strand of literature that my paper is contributing to is on the norms and female participation in the economy. What my paper showing is that new norms might emerge as a result of reconciliation between the pre-existing norms and new economic development forces. And I show that nominally conservative symbols such as veiling might actually help to transition towards a more progressive goal, such as female access to formal labor market. And the last strand of literature to which I'm contributing is to show a new evidence that economic development might not necessarily always go hand in hand with the marginalization of religion. Okay, now I'm going to talk about the data. Veiling is a cultural phenomenon that typically not very easy to measure. So the typical way to measure veiling is through survey, but this method might actually suffer from several things. So first is reporting bias. So we could imagine that in survey, what typically happen is either the surveyor asks the respondent whether they were the veil or not, or typically the surveyor will observe directly the respondent and then code in their sheet whether the respondent is wearing the veil or not. In either of these cases, there is a very it's very likely that they're going to be either measurement error or reporting bias, because for instance, if the respondent is staying at home when the interview is conducted, then she might actually not wearing the veil, because veil are usually only worn outside of the home. And also, if, for instance, the surveyor themselves are wearing the veil, then the answer or the response of the respondent might be biased because of social desirability or feeling uncomfortable to give certain answers. But I guess the most important drawback from survey data is the fact that they're not systematically available. So it's impossible for me to get a comparable estimate for a relatively long period of time. Okay, so in order to solve this problem, I measure veiling by looking at high school records. So in Indonesia, and I guess in somewhere else as well, there are like big book in which the information about the student, as well as 3x4 centimeters photo of the students are attached. So what I did is basically, of course, not myself. I have like 50 other research assistant helping me. We went to high school and we borrowed this book, and then we just simply count the number of female students who wear and wearing the veil. So this process has led us to be able to plot this data. So here you can see the plot of the proportion of female students who are wearing veil by district. So we are able to collect the data from 49 districts. What is interesting here is that we see a lot of variation across district. In some district, you see the evolution of veiling from 0 to even 100%. In some district, the evolutions stop even before 50%, and in some district this doesn't even start at all. So there are a lot of variation that might be exploited here to understand why it happens in some places and not in the others. Okay, so I use this data in order to create a variable that I call veil take-up, which is basically the fraction of female high school students who wear a veil by school district year. Another data that I need is data on job participation for male and female, and this basically sourced from the Sakernas annual labor force survey that are issued by Badan Pusat Statistik. And this is basically the fraction of young female aged 20 to 24 who participate in formal employment by district year. The other variable of interest that is important for this paper is something they call export shock, which I will discuss a bit in more detail later. And this is a share instrumental variable, which basically measuring the relative demand for Indonesian product in international market with respect to the base year. And this is calculated by district year. And I construct this variable by combining several data sets, including the statistic industry, large and medium manufacturing census, also issued by BPS, and also the data from UN Comtrade to get the value of international trade. So by the end of the day, the data set that I have is a panel data of 93 schools located in 49 districts, span over 22 years period. Okay, so next I will discuss about the empirical framework or the regression specification that I'm using. So for the baseline regression, I'm just running a vanilla OLS regression of veil or veiling rate in school S, district D at year T. And because I'm interested to look at the relationship or correlation with female access in the labor market, fem job here is basically the fraction of female population participated in the formal employment in district D at year T. And then I put a lot of controls at different level, including at the school level, district level, and national level. Also control for district fixed effect, district specific time trends, and also we have the error terms there. Now, for some of you, probably some of this, the PhD student in the audience might jump into my neck and saying like, whoa, but like there are a lot of other variables that might explain veil and female job participation. But this correlation is just simply because there are these underlying other factors or confounders that explain the correlation. Okay, so for instance, it could be the case that the district that religious districts are more economically vibrant. Okay, so we can see the relationship between veiling and economic job participation because of these, other confounding factors. So in order to address this problem, what I'm doing next is basically to instrument this potentially endogenous variable or fem job with something that I called export shock. So what is export shock? So export shock is a shift-share IV that I construct using 3 different components. Okay, so the first component is value, which basically the normalized real value of international demand for Indonesian product in sector K at year T. And then the second element is something that I call sector share. Basically, this is the share of sector K in district D at the base year. And the third element is something that I call female score, which is basically the share of female labor in sector K at the base year. And then I sum up the multiplication of these 3 elements based on how many sector available in the district. So the look of this IV look a bit overwhelming, but let me tell you what is the intuition of this IV. Okay, so basically what this variable is measuring is how much economic shock that happened in the district based on the composition of the industry and the composition of labor force within that industry. So this variable is going to assign a higher economic, a higher value or a higher treatment in the areas that specialize in female intensive industries, okay? And it will assign less treatment or lower treatment in the areas that specialize in male intensive industries. So for instance, if there is a shock in the demand for tobacco product, for instance, in the international market, so the Indonesian district that specialize in making cigarettes or other tobacco products will experience the shock or a jump in the demand for female labor because mostly tobacco industry employ a lot of women. On the other hand, for instance, if there is a shock in the demand for mining products, for instance, in the international market, the district that specializes in mining product does not necessarily receive the shock because mining factories or mining products, mining industry does not employ many women in the factories. So this is the idea of how export shock is going to affect female participation in the formal sector. Okay, so before I'm showing you the regression results, I think it will be useful to look at just like a simple scatter plot on the first stage and the reduced form because I'm using IV. On the left-hand side, we can see the simple scatter plot looking at the correlation between export shock and formal job participation. So we can see that the area that received more export shock will also have higher demand for a female in the job in the formal job market. On the right panel, we can see the simple correlation between export shock and veil take-up, and we can see that the areas that receive a higher export shock will also experience a higher veil take-up. Okay, so now I'm going to show you, I'm showing the result of the vanilla OLS regression. And here we can see that in the normal vanilla OLS regression, just looking at the correlation between veil take-up and formal job participation, we can see that correlation is positive and significant. And this value stays even after you control for a different level of control variables. So those are the results from the vanilla OLS regression. What I show you here is the first stage regression, which is basically the statistical analysis equivalent of the first graph that I was showing you. And here you can see that export shock has a positive and significant effect on formal job, female formal job participation. And again, this relationship is robust even after controlling several levels of variables at the different levels. And this is the main regression results that showing you the second stage of the SLS estimate, as well as the reduced form estimate. So what we can see here, I standardize both. And the reason I standardize both is because I have a lot of other checks with other variable that has different values, right? So I standardize those so that it's easier for me to compare the magnitude of the effect on a different variable as well. What we can see here is one standard deviation increase in formal job participation has caused about one standard deviation increase in veil take-up. So in the original unit, this is corresponding to about 2, so 1% increase in formal job participation is corresponding to about 2% increase in veil take-up. And in the lower panel, we see the reduced form estimate. And again, the reduced form estimate also confirm our intuition or the analysis that I have shown you before. Okay, so I think I still have 5 minutes. I'm just gonna, 1, 2, okay. So I'm just gonna quickly go through the mechanism. So those are the phenomenon that we see, right? But I guess now for me personally, the bigger question is about like why, right? You know, I have to admit that, you know, this part of the analysis is a bit, you know, like less precise than the previous one. Because like there are so many ways that could explain the mechanism of the phenomenon that I haven't shown you. But just to sum up very quickly, and we can look at it into more detail later if we have time. What I found is that it seems that the phenomenon that I have presented to you just now seems to indicate that a veil is used actually as a negotiation device. So the kind of framework of thinking that I have, you know, with which I open my talk today. So there are 2 pieces of evidence that lead me into this kind of conclusion. The first one is, you know, I try to understand what kind of woman actually, you know, wearing the veil. So I borrowed, or not borrowed, I'm using 2 different surveys. One is by Pew Research survey and the other from survey by local polling companies. And I found that education has a positive correlation to veiling. And actually this result was also affirmed by several other studies on veiling, also using the survey, showing that education level has a very significant predictive level on the probability of women wearing the veil. So the way I interpret this evidence is that it seems to be that those women who will pay the higher price if they don't go to the labor market are those who wear veil. Okay, so if they don't go to the labor market, they're going to waste basically their education investment, and therefore they are the one who wants to go to the labor market, and veiling might facilitate this. So they are those who adopt veiling. So yeah, the second part of evidence that's showing you that as we show, I've shown you in the graph at the beginning of the talk that the effect doesn't seem to bite when we use instead informal job participation. The idea here is that informal job participation typically does not really require them to be at the particular place in a particular time without the supervision of the family member, right? Because informal are usually more casual, and people can decide when and where they can do the job, and so on and so forth. So this this pressure of protecting yourself and dignity is not really there for informal job. And indeed, we cannot really see the relationship between informal job participation and veil take-up. So I can discuss about the other alternative mechanism that I don't think might not be the best to explain the phenomenon. But since Sam already like staring at me, I'm just going to stop here, and we can discuss more in the Q&A section. Thanks so much for your attention.
Thank you, Naila. Let's hand it over to Vicky if you want to stop sharing your screen.
Right.
Okay, let me share mine. Okay, so thanks very much for inviting me to participate in this event and for giving me the chance to read closely Naila's paper. It is a really great paper. And I think it's so interesting that it makes contributions in sort of multiple dimensions. So there is one contribution that I would frame as broader for economics or for social science in general, which is this connection between economic development, economic modernization, and its interaction with cultural norms. I guess the received wisdom is that with economic modernization comes more secular values, less religiosity. And this is a setup in which we see that it's actually more complicated than that, this interaction. And in fact, we can get modernization, increased female employment as part of that, actually increasing religious expression in public. So this is a very interesting and new finding, I think. But this paper also contributes to a question that I think is very important. It's of interest in many different contexts and doesn't really have a very good answer, which is, why do Muslim women veil? So I'm not an expert on Indonesia, but I do study this question of integration of women from Muslim majority countries in Western Europe and the United States. And that is a big question there. It's a big question in policy discussions. There are these assumptions that women veil because they are coerced into veiling by conservative families or communities. And on the basis of these assumptions, there are policies that are enacted in many cases to ban veiling. And what's really interesting is that we actually have no systematic evidence or answer to this question, so we don't know. And I think this is one of the first papers I have seen that provides such an answer. And so I think the insights from this paper have a broader reach. So they are really informative for many different contexts, and I think they fit really well with much recent research. So I'm mentioning here my own paper, which Naila also mentioned, in which I'm looking at the opposite direction of banning veiling and effects on female labor force participation. And I think the result there fits very well, because what we see is that if veiling is a tool that women can use in order to participate more, then removing that tool lowers participation. So this is what we find, for example, in the case of the headscarf ban in France. It also fits with, I think, a literature that is not mentioned in the paper, but is a really good complement, which is not about veiling specifically, but about accommodating religious expression and how that can increase participation of women. In this case, the papers I'm citing are from Turkey and the effect of Islamic schools. So it's participation in education, but also later in the labor market. So I think it fits really, really nicely there and makes a new contribution. And the data in this paper is just so cool. I think the idea of using the school yearbooks for systematically measuring this phenomenon that we otherwise only can get in snapshots from surveys is a brilliant idea. So really great. So I have some comments. Most of my comments actually are on the mechanisms, which Naila didn't get the chance to talk about so much. So maybe I fill in some things there. But I have one comment on the main effect here. This causal effect of increased female labor force participation, female employment, unveiling, which, by the way, I should say, I believe this result, and I think that the Bartik instrument is a good way to get at it. But I do think that we can scrutinize it a little bit more just to be certain. So the identification here comes from shocks to industries that employ more females than males. And so one question we can ask is that when there is a shock and growth in such industries, what else characterizes these industries and how might this affect the district more broadly? So here it seems like a move from heavy industry, steel manufacturing that is more male dominated to something like textiles. And so I'm wondering whether the relative growth of these particular industries means something else for the district other than just increased female employment. And so maybe one thing that could be done is just some of the things that are used as controls, perhaps put on the left-hand side, just to see what might be responding to this shock. The other thing, which is, I don't think it's so much really identification as it is interpretation. The way I'm reading this, there's a relative effect here. So more growth in female intensive industries has also a relative effect, sort of less in relative terms employment in male intensive industries. And I'm wondering whether that might be meaningful in this context or, doing part of the job. Do we see, we know that when female income surpasses male income, there's a lot of research on that. There are negative responses on the parts of men, and women have to moderate such that they reach more or less the same level. So is this some kind of status threat or increased conservatism on the part of males that would require more veiling of women? We see this among more educated women, which means that it's not that men demand of women to veil in general, more it's specific to women participating in employment, but it seems like a channel worth considering. So as Naila said, I think the more interesting part is why we see this. And the proposed answer is that this is a negotiation device which allows women to participate while at the same time, either at the personal level staying true to their values or at a social level sort of either signaling or abiding by specific norms. And what I think is really interesting is this table, which is survey responses of women on why they choose to veil. Where the vast majority of them say that they do it out of their own will. So it's not that they're forced by parents or by spouses. So I think that's really interesting. To some extent, it's evidence for this negotiation device. I would say that, as Naila said already, it's notoriously difficult to diagnose things like social pressure or social considerations in surveys. So I think this is good evidence, but we can take it with a grain of salt. One thing to note is that all of the evidence comes from school-aged girls, but I guess this is survey data of women more broadly. So it might be interesting to see what happens when we restrict to the relevant age groups and whether parental pressures play more of a role there. But generally, if it is a negotiation device, but women choose it out of their own will, we don't see the negotiation element here so much. Negotiation means that, yeah, women choose to do this, but it's also because they are responding to someone who sort of demands it of them. And so I was wondering whether there are some other scenario that we might at least entertain. And some of them might not be relevant to the Indonesian society, but I'll just put them out there. So the first one is, when I'm looking at this graph, which is veiling rates over time in the different districts in the sample, the thing that really stands out to me are all these discrete discontinuity points. We have these jumps, like tipping points, where a district moves from a certain low rate of veiling to sometimes 100%. or if it's not 100%, it's still a discrete jump. And so that's something that's quite difficult to explain with individual incentives unless there is a sharp change in the economy at that particular year, which might be something to look into. But it's very consistent with social influence. And that's exactly the graph we see when we have a model of social influence or fads underlying this data. And so one story I can come up with is that, it's a story of changing role models. Maybe nothing changes in the behavior of women. When they're at home, they don't wear the headscarf. When they go outside of the home, they do. So it's not that they veil more because of employment as a negotiation device. It's just that now they are more public facing, so they wear the veil as they would. The rule has not changed. But we see more women with veils around, and that's something that the school-aged children in the data might be, or the school-aged girls might be observing and to some extent imitating, especially if it signifies something for what it means to wear the veil, to be a working independent woman. So that story seems consistent, and it's just a one way to explain what's happening, which is driven by higher female employment. The paper rules out income effects and changed tastes in response to income. And the argument there is that if it was income, we would also see increased veiling with informal employment because income goes up there relative to no employment. I do think there is maybe a possibility that this is something that kicks in after a certain level of income, which might be higher for formal employment, or in general, just signaling, as I said before, consistent with the previous story of, what it means to wear the veil, being a working woman, an independent woman. And so this is something that was in the paper, that the new veil was championed by young, educated, urban middle class women. So this is signaling, but it seems like a different story from the Carvalho story. So I would say that these first two stories combined seem to me like a plausible explanation worth exploring. There are two other things that I don't believe as much, but I'll put them out there. The first one is something else changing in response to these sectoral changes that correlates with veiling? So the paper rules out religiosity. The instrument does not predict changes in religiosity, but I'm not sure that is. So actually what's really striking in the paper is that in the survey data, religiosity does not correlate with veiling. So neither religiosity nor support for Islamic parties seem to be a significant predictor of veiling. So if we don't see it changing, this might not tell us much. The question then is, which kinds of values or attitudes actually predict veiling, and are those ones that might be changing in response to these shocks? One thing that I did notice is that a significant predictor of veiling is marriage. And so maybe one explanation or part of the whole story is that as women enter formal employment, maybe they delay marriage. And because married women are less likely to wear the veil, maybe that's one channel through which this is manifesting. And then finally, the paper also rules out compositional effects, the fact that as returns to female employment increase, maybe girls who come from families that are more conservative, more religious, enter education, because there are no changes in the enrollment rates. And I think that's good evidence. One thing that I was wondering is whether this data from the yearbooks actually allows you to get more directly at the compositional effect, maybe measure some characteristics of the students that would signal either religious values or possibly class background. So I don't know if names are available. I couldn't exactly understand what was on the yearbooks, but that might be a way of more directly testing this channel. And then finally, I think that one thing that's really interesting to me, and it's these two different parts of the Carvalho story of the commitment and the signaling, is whether veiling is more of a preference or more of a norm. So women do this of their own accord because it's their values that dictate that now, if they go out to work, they have to sort of balance that with increased modesty. Or is it more that the society around them demands it, or they feel that this is the case? So they're responding to expectations. And so we saw one piece of evidence, which is women say they choose it. But I think it would be interesting to think whether there could be some survey evidence on what people think about women who wear the veil. Do they approve or disapprove, especially if those are women who work? And if there's approval or disapproval, who does it come from? Is it men or other women? That might tell us something about the norm aspect. And it's very possible that both stories are going on at the same time. So I'll leave it at that. I think this paper is super interesting. And in my view, at least coming from a context, studying context other than Indonesia, I think that pinning down these mechanisms would really increase the external validity of this and how much we can learn for many different contexts about the motivations for veiling. And that's something that really has not been answered so far because the systematic data is lacking. And that's where I think this paper is uniquely positioned to make a contribution. So I'll stop here. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Vicky. You've given us all a lot to think about. Naila, I don't know if you want to take a minute or two to reply to anything in particular Vicky raised. Otherwise, I'm happy to raise some questions from the chat.
Okay, so yeah, thanks so much, Vicky. It was very, very useful. So since there are really a lot of points, I guess some of them are I'm going to probably just quickly address now, and I'm going to leave some others for next time. So yeah, I think from your comments, the one thing that I think I did some a follow-up study to understand whether this is norms or this is willingness, and those are basically very difficult, right? To differentiate those. So one of the things that I did, I also do some general survey on the population, showing the picture of different women. So it seems that, so what I found is very preliminary. So, I mean, it's maybe for another paper. So it seems to be that it depending on what kind of role this woman has to do. So there is a different preference depending on the kind of things the woman do. So if the woman actually has to, have a lot of context with public, it seems that the preference is for them to wear the veil. And when I separate between male and female respondents, interestingly, these norms only significant for female respondents. So it seems that the pressure is not from the male, but it's actually the norms among the females, that they see that what is appropriate for a woman when this kind of activities involve a lot of interaction with other people or other men that are not your family members, are the female community themselves. So yeah, so thanks to for pointing that out. Yeah, for the rest, yeah, I have to think about it and yeah, address it in my paper. Thanks so much.
Great. So there's a question in the chat, and also something that I thought even prior to the question, that the audience would benefit from hearing a bit about how you selected the schools, the types of schools, and kind of where they fall in the spectrum of religiosity, and are these religious schools? Are they public schools? Can you tell us a bit more about them?
Okay, yeah, thank you. So yeah, I forgot to mention this. So the sample that I'm using is only public school. And the reason is because this is the only type of school where we can see the variation of students who wear or not wearing the veil. Okay, so in private school in Indonesia, usually you have either Islamic school or Catholic school. In Islamic school, normally, typically they require students to wear the veil. So I will not be able to see any variation across the year from this school. So I exclude them from the sample. And from, for instance, Catholic school, usually it's very strange for, student to wear the veil in Catholic school. So again, there is no variation in terms of veiling in this type of school. So yeah, so I excluded those schools because simply there is no variation there. It's only public school. Yeah.
And can you say a bit more about where these districts are within Indonesia, and kind of how they, where they fall in kind of the spectrum of religiosity across the different parts of the Muslim areas of the country?
I'm not sure if I have it in my, let me see. So I have a map. Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't have it now. But basically, the district was randomly chosen in two main islands, which is Sumatra and Java. So I just pick randomly among all of the districts that lies in those two islands. And the reason I do that is because the majority of population, so 60% of Indonesian population live in Java and 20% live in Sumatra. So it's more efficient to do the sampling in these two. So yeah, I would say I cannot say anything about like Kalimantan or Sulawesi because the sampling is not from there. So yeah, roughly it's mainly about in Java and Sumatra, and those are basically taken randomly for all of the district in those two islands.
Okay, great. And then another question. Do you know, is there any way to kind of assess the types of sectors in which there might be more mixing between genders in the workplace? You mentioned some new work looking at kind of public-facing occupations where you might have more contact with the general public, but I wonder if there's any kind of other data you might be able to kind of bring to bear on the possibility that there's variation in kind of the extent to which men and women are working together under the same roof or on the same production lines or
yeah, I think it should in theory be possible because the manufacturing industries data that I was talking about also has the information on the share of male and female workers. So yeah, so you're saying that it might be interesting to look at the variation of the effect depending on whether your contact with other male are more pervasive or not.
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
So yeah, so thanks for that idea. Yeah, I think there should be something could be done on this.
Yeah, great. So I'm trying to digest a long and interesting question from Erica Larson. Right. So the question is, if you could tell us a bit more about how you coded the veiling, the images in the yearbook, and or just say a bit more about the kind of ethnographic process that you use to code up the veiling outcomes.
Okay. So the veiling outcome is human coded. So basically, I ask them to count the number of the picture of woman wearing and not wearing the veil. But at the same time, I also ask the RA to take a random pictures of this number. So in that sense, and if you could calculate, like if your aim is to calculate the share of this woman and the maximum standard deviation between 0 and 1 is when you have standard deviation of 0.5. If you take about like 120 pictures, you're sure that, if this, because usually the book is organized based on name, right? So if you just take either like odd numbers or even numbers or even pages, so you can get like a random sample of these photos, and then you can match the numbers that they actually reported and the numbers that you can calculate from this random, basically proof that the numbers actually back up by the data. Apart from that, I also hire like external data converter, like kind of there is like a company in India that can help you to recode the data. So there are like several layers of checks to make sure that the numbers are not very far from the actual numbers. Yeah, but the original data that you use is human coded. I wish I have like, this machine that can do deep learning and automatically code someone's picture. I'm sure someone has done it. So if you have any ideas of some contact that I can you can connect to, that will be also helpful. Yeah.
Yeah. Great. No, I mean, it's super innovative data collection. So, you deserve a lot of credit for doing that and kind of showing the way for what might be possible in future work. The one other question I wanted to raise, I don't see any more in the chat, but the one other one I wanted to raise was the question of diversity, both across like interreligious diversity and then kind of diversity among the Muslim population, and whether in places where you see kind of greater diversity among Muslims in terms of the extent to which they might be voting for different religious parties, they might come from different religious traditions historically. Does that kind of diversity matter for some of these mechanisms that you're talking about?
Yeah, okay. So in the current specification, I control for district fixed effect, right? And the problem with that is basically I also absorb a lot of variation or characteristic of the district itself, including whether this is like a Muslim majority district or Muslim minority district, right? And I also saw that the share, at least the share of religion that you can trace from the national census doesn't really change, like even in the matter of 20 years. So it tend to like stays, as it were. So I haven't done that, but of course, there are some things that could be done to understand whether, there are some variation depending on heterogeneity, because that might affect also basically what is more acceptable in the district, right? And whether, this signaling, how does this signaling work? Is it like work better in more heterogeneous or in more homogeneous society? Yeah, that's an interesting direction to guess on. Yeah.
And the last thing I'll kind of end with is just to reiterate Vicky's really interesting observation about the tipping points or apparent tipping points in unveiling, where you see like really sharp changes from one year to the next, and whether you've thought about digging into that, because you only have so many districts, and potentially you could. You run the risk of course, having a very small sample, but at the same time, that makes it possible to kind of maybe dig in and do a little bit more kind of forensic historical work in some sense.
Okay, yeah. No, I noticed that, and actually I received this comment in several venues when I presented this paper. It's just that I haven't get my head around how can we capture like this tipping point dimension? Because mostly the tipping point papers that I found, and I still don't know how to apply those, and digging into this. And these are very interesting observation. And I should do some more thinking on that.
Great. Well, thank you both. Thank you, Naila, for a really stimulating presentation and for taking the time to share your work with us, and to Vicky for a great discussion, and as always, kind of giving speakers a ton of work ahead. So thanks to you both. So I did want to flag the next installment of the seminar series. We'll have in about a month, at the end of April, Professor Laksono Trisnantoro will be presenting on COVID-19 and healthcare in Indonesia, and the discussant will be Retna Hanani. So please do join us at the end of April, and we hope to see you all again. In the meantime, everyone, please stay well, and have a good evening, good day, good morning. And thanks very much.